So hello everybody. Nice to see you here. It is amazing to have such a big plenary room which is almost full. It's really a very good occasion. Now we are coming to plenary session 2. The title is Urban Climate Change and Increasing Housing Vulnerability. And I like this kind of conflicts because environmental policies and social policies are not always going into the same direction. And this conflict is very interesting. Both policies want to do something good, and sometimes they have externalities and bad consequences. We will have a panel with Gerald Mills and Jennifer Duyne-Barenstein. Maybe the pronunciation was not totally correct. My name is Ivan Tosics, and I will moderate this session. A few introductory slides, and the first slide comes back to COVID, because we have to, maybe you already forgot what COVID was. This was the pandemic, yeah? A few years ago. Our life has changed, and COVID has to be remembered because a lot of interesting things happened within a very short time. COVID was a shock. Climate change is a much longer crisis. Both are crises, but they are different. So what can we learn from the shock type crisis against climate change? First of all, people's life has changed, yeah? As you can see from the picture that many people moved out from home and they didn't use so much online media, but then later they used it again. Also, our cities have changed. And I like very much this picture on the left-hand side, which shows how abnormal our cities are. Everything controlled and occupied by cars. And in fact, pedestrians are second rank residents in the city. During COVID, the public spaces have been occupied and everyone went out happily. Now, obviously, where people are biking in the middle of the road, there are cars there again. During COVID, there was a very interesting debate about urban density. And I read papers from the United States. Some sociologists said, finally, Los Angeles has beaten New York. Los Angeles, as the sprawled city, now finally it could prove that it is much better to live in Los Angeles than in New York. Because in New York you are close together and the pandemic is much more dangerous. But then later analysis said that this is not totally true. In fact, it is not at all true because larger urban density has a lot of advantages. Networks for mutual help, needs-based expansion of commercial delivery and care services are much easier in dense areas. You can better organize healthcare, etc. So finally, even in US research, the questioning, the correlation between density and infection numbers has disappeared. And I think this is the correct interpretation, which says that not density, but overcrowding is what it is dangerous. So you can have the same number of people, but if they are living in overcrowded, in bad housing conditions, then the pandemic has a bigger effect of them. But if the same density happens and they are living in good housing conditions, then the pandemic is not really more dangerous than in sprawled environments. And then we have learned a lot about the social aspects of a crisis. You can see the guy who is a worker, a building industry worker, he cannot work from home office. And home office really increased the difference between people. Some people who can work from the home, probably some of them still work now from home. And if you have a large home, then it is better for you, no problem. But 2/3 of people cannot work from home. And if they live in really overcrowded conditions, like the right-hand side picture, then it is really not very good. Now I'm coming to the end of this introduction, and probably you know this hockey stick graph. I have learned from environmental experts that this is the hockey stick graph, which shows, obviously, the increasing dangers of the climate crisis. Today we are even above 5, probably, 38 degrees in Paris, which is not really an everyday issue. And because of this climate crisis, the European Commission in 2019 started the European Green Deal. And I remember when Ursula von der Leyen came into office, she was really putting on the table a new policy, a policy about green transition. And this policy has a lot of different aspects. One of them is the Fit for 55 aspect. And this has a really concrete aims with the European housing stock and concrete aims with European transport, because these are the two issues that we can influence, and they are really responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. And then large projects started to handle climate change. I was just recently in Krakow in the Cities Forum, and in the Cities Forum there was a panel about sustainability transformation. People were talking about climate city contract. They were complaining, the cities were mainly complaining that there is a lack of direct funding to cities and they cannot really do what they want. But we also have seen a lot of innovative examples. For example, Galicia region, they use the Covenant of Mayors framework to give money and incentives to cities to do real changes. Valencia has set up the largest urban sun collector system in the cemeteries of the city, which is a very nice place where you can collect sun. Warsaw mentioned a greenery fund and a large park in the center of the city. And also Bologna mentioned Bologna Verde as the main plan for the city. So the question is, what are the consequences of these large green interventions? Whether the social impacts are really taken into account. This is what we will talk about today. The link between climate and housing. It is really important to analyze the impact of the green transition on housing inequalities. Many colleagues are here from the Rehousing Project, which is a Horizon Europe project, and we are exactly looking at this link, and also Jennifer is part of this project. So we will tell you maybe in 1 year what are the outcomes. We are just doing now the empirical work. We are really exploring energy efficient building renovation, nature-based solutions, and densifications. And we are looking into 9 different countries trying to trace the social consequences. So the plan for the plenary is, I will raise 3 questions. The first question is the effect of climate change on vulnerability. And this question will mainly be addressed by Gerald. The second question will be effects of climate mitigation and adaptation on vulnerability. This will mainly be answered by Jennifer. And the third one will be how can we handle the negative social aspects of climate interventions on vulnerability. I'm not sure that we will have time for questions. Let's see. Of course, if you don't need lunch, then we can have a long debate, but probably you will need. If you have any question and you are afraid that maybe you cannot ask it, then please send me an email, okay? And then I will distribute the questions and we will deal with these questions. Okay, you have seen my email address. Okay, so effects of different aspects of climate change on vulnerability. Gerald.
Hello everybody, my name is Gerald Mills. I'm properly not somebody who does stuff on housing. I do a lot of work on the climate of cities. And I think many of you will have noticed that cities have moved to the forefront of discussions about climate change on the planet. And the reason for this is that cities are primarily responsible for the greenhouse gases that go into the atmosphere. So they are major drivers of climate change. They're also uniquely at risk from climate change because they occupy particular parts of the world that makes them especially exposed to certain outcomes, such as heat waves, such as sea level rise, such as flooding. I should use this instead. The other reason that cities are especially vulnerable is that the cities themselves actually modify the climate where they're located. And the reason for this is because cities are fundamentally manufactured environments. And the biggest component, of course, of that manufactured environment are roads and buildings. So I want to make an argument today is that part of the discussion about housing and vulnerability must include the spaces in between the housing, the outdoor environmental space that we are connected to. In other words, for reducing the division between the indoor and the outdoor. This, of course, is the famous graph. This is the Mauna Loa curve. I hope it continues. Apparently, the station where they make these measurements is due to be shut. But it gives us a record of carbon dioxide emissions on the planet for about the last 50 years. So if I was to break down that carbon dioxide and find out where it came from, then about 1/3 of it is associated with buildings. And most of those buildings are inside cities. So not surprisingly, if I want to understand climate change on the planet, I have to talk about cities. Because carbon dioxide is fundamentally a point source pollutant coming from points which are the cities. I'd like to remind you, all the cities in the world occupy less than 3% of the land area of the planet. So in other words, all the emissions that are driving climate change are coming from that tiny proportion of the landscape. That's also, of course, where more than half the population currently resides. And the projections is that it'll be about 2/3 of the population of the planet within about 30 years. In fact, the big changes in the planet are not in the cities like Paris or London, but they are in the big cities of the global south, particularly in places like Delhi, cities of China, and the emerging massive cities inside Africa. So, I don't think the issue about climate change is just about housing. It also includes all the other spaces that we occupy. This actually is an image from Los Angeles, where their provision of shading devices is a political issue. These people are waiting for a bus, so the only shelter they have is by crowding as close as possible to a nearby building. What will the climate change bring for us? But if I was just to look at buildings, then a good way of looking at that is to look at what they refer to in architecture as heating and cooling degree days. That's to say, how many days I can expect to have to cool or to heat the building. This is a very good indicator of the extent to which the climate is changing, and as a consequence, the energy spent inside the city is going to change. So what you see in the very top diagram are the current cooling and heating degree days. Not surprisingly, the cooling degree days are concentrated in the east and the north. The heating degree days are concentrated around the Mediterranean. But the big changes that will happen in the future, because of global warming, will be that the number of cooling degree days will decrease, which is shown on the left-hand side. In other words, it's going to get easier to heat a home in Paris, in London, in Dublin. But on the right-hand side, it shows the changes in the cooling degree days. In other words, it's going to get substantially warmer and more difficult to cool buildings in the future. Now, it's possible to actually look at this in general. This is work that I do with a colleague. These are major cities in the world in which we look at the heating and cooling degree days, how it changes the future for those. You can see that for many cities, particularly in Western Europe, North America, it's pretty much balanced. In other words, the change in the heating and cooling degree days pretty much compensate for each other. For all the big cities on the planet, which are now all in the global south, the net effect is going to be dramatic. It's going to be the increase in the cooling degree days that's going to be the driver. Now, of course, I don't have to go very far to show you the effects of climate change. I downloaded this image from Météo France just 2 days ago. This is the plume of air that's come up from Africa that now is covering France. And we're in an orange heating phase. In other words, you're supposed to take actions. So there's an interesting thing about adaptation and mitigation. You have to adapt because you're stuck with this air coming from Africa. And how do you adapt? Well, hopefully your building's got the capacity to allow you to change, but hopefully the outdoor space allows you to do the same thing. This is what the warning indicates from Météo France. The thing I just want to point out is the link between the indoor and outdoor spaces. Obviously drink water because that's your natural air conditioning system. Do not go out during the daytime hours. So there is adaptation for you. Try to go to a cool or air-conditioned place for 2 to 3 hours a day while continuing to respect physical distance and barrier gestures. That means you need access to spaces that are cool. So that means that you're going to an air-conditioned space like this, or you're going to avail of a park where there might be water. During the day, close shutters, curtains, and windows, and at nighttime you ventilate. Now here's an interesting thing. When people die from heat waves, it's because of nighttime temperatures, not daytime temperatures, because at nighttime your body tries to recover. So the way you try to recover is your body tries to adjust. And if the outdoor temperature is actually raised and you bring it into the house, then I'm afraid you don't get much relief. One of the problems associated with cities is not only do you get a heat wave, but you also get what's known as an urban heat island effect. And the urban heat island is strongest in the densest part of the city, the parts of the city like in central Paris. So when we talk about vulnerability and risk, it's concentrated. You need to know about the hazard, which of course is the climate is changing. You need to know about the exposure, and I'm telling you the exposure is greater in cities than in any other types of environments. Then you need to know about the vulnerability. The vulnerability has got to do with how you can manage your exposure to that risk. So a big question we have to ask ourselves is whether the buildings that we've constructed, our layers and layers of historical buildings, are actually going to be up to the task for a climate for which they were never designed. And that will mean that they'll have to be far better, I feel, connected to the outdoor space. And our colleague Ivan brought up this issue about outdoor spaces and COVID. This is an image that an artist created for me when we were working during COVID, during a brief period of time when people were restricted within 1 kilometre of their house. So we started an exercise and asking people to map out their routes. What we discovered, of course, is that most people found their neighbourhoods completely uninteresting. They did not find them places that they could go to that could experience different types of environments. But this wasn't heat, it was about visual, it was about trees, it was about vegetation. And on the left-hand side, this is the consequence. This is a public space that was made available in the middle of the city, a famous park called Mountjoy Square. And during the middle of the COVID, because people were gathering there because they couldn't stay in their homes, they threatened to shut down the park. Now, I'm not sure what people were supposed to do if you cut down the only public space available, other than simply to go home. So I think the fight for housing also includes the fight for outdoor spaces. And that means, to some extent, taking our perspective away from just the house to talk about the neighbourhood. That includes the buildings themselves and the spaces in between.
Okay, we have learned something, not only the housing, but also the area of the housing is interesting. The social consequences are obviously the same. If you have bad housing, usually it is in a bad area, but let's see what are the sociological consequences. So I think Jennifer is coming now. Yes.
Yeah. Well, first of all, yes, thank you very much for your interesting presentation. Also, thank you for the previous plenary session, which I really found very interesting and, of course, raised a lot of issues that we can observe also in Switzerland. We are actually, yes, you have mentioned, yes, what are the impacts of climate change on vulnerability, but let's now look at what are the impacts of climate, institutionalized means of adapting and mitigating climate change. And we are actually examining this in the framework of a European project, a project that is called Rehousing, and its name Contextualized Pathways to Reduce Housing Inequalities in the Green Transition. And we are examining exactly in 9 countries what is happening in terms of institutionalized measures to adapt and mitigate to climate change. And it's very interesting because we know Europe has the same climate goals, basically, climate neutrality by 2050, but when it comes to the implementation strategies, they vary very much across different countries. And again, what varies very much is the different housing regimes in which these measures are implemented. Then, of course, also within countries, we have quite a lot of differences. So we have a very complex reality on the ground when it comes to assessing what are the impacts of climate mitigation and adaptation strategies. In our project, Rehousing, we are particularly looking at three aspects which have a strong impact on housing, which is urban densification, and its nature-based solution, and energy refurbishments, which are considered very important measures to attain climate neutrality. And I will talk you a bit, I will tell you a bit the example of Switzerland, where we are doing currently research, but actually in this room there are a lot of colleagues that are working with us in the rehousing project in their country, and maybe they can complement a little bit what I will present. Ivan has asked me not to bring too many data and statistics, but Ivan loves to work with pictures, so I will actually also show you a few pictures related to this. So first of all, about densification. Densification in Switzerland is legally mandatory since we had the revision of the Spatial Planning Act in 2014, which has, what have been the consequences? So of course, densification makes a lot of sense. We don't want to consume too much land anymore. We want to bring people near to each other to reduce transport costs. We have, of course, also economic advantages that we don't have to expand the infrastructure on wide areas. But what it has led in Switzerland by making densification legally mandatory is that the land prices have gone up dramatically. And this has created, and of course, cities have had to reduce the area in which they can build, so there has been a lot of incentives to build more dense in areas, which meant very much that affordable housing, like the one you can see in this picture, which is actually in my neighborhood, is being demolished systematically to build a new housing that is supposed to be more dense, and we can again ask what does actually dense housing mean? Is it dense construction or is it dense population? And what we see very often is that we increase the built-up density, which doesn't mean that we are increasing the population. So this is a house in my neighborhood. It was affordable, and it is a housing that was demolished in order to make space for more dense population. So here you see very much these dramatic scenes, which you see now all over Zurich, of housing that was in perfect condition that is being demolished. And this housing is inhabited typically by the lower income people, the most vulnerable people, which include elderly people, single parents, migrants, and refugees. It's very clear that these are the people who are affected by this demolition. Maybe what I forgot to mention is Switzerland is a country of tenants. Only 37% of the Swiss population own the dwelling in which they live. So you can imagine that implementing densification, energy refurbishment policies, and also nature-based solutions has a completely different impact than when you're talking about countries where the majority of the people own their dwelling. So here, actually, it's the housing owners that have these incentives to demolish, to refurbish, and so on. So here you see a typical housing that used to be inhabited by lower income people that is being demolished. And here you see what is the perception of the people about this demolition. Very much, of course, they think it's not so much, about densifying the city. What is written here in Swiss German, it's nur noch big business, which means only big business. So obviously, the way the city is densifying is perceived as a business opportunity and is perceived as being actually legitimizing a sort of a whole change in the ownership structure and in the tenancy conditions. And yes, here you see the type of housing that came up at exactly the same plot. And it's the promoters of this housing were very proud to announce that this was the first housing built by Herzog and de Meuron in Zurich. And of course, you can wonder for whom this housing was built and also what type of people can afford the type of rents. Here you see the advertisement of these apartments in the city of Zurich in this particular site. And of course, if you see this type of rents, you can Swiss franc is about €1.10. So you can imagine what type of people can live in this Herzog and de Meuron housing. So this is very much the situation, just as a sort of a snapshot in the problems caused by. Well, I mean, average prices in Zurich now, it's very difficult to talk about, because what is the complication in Zurich? I mean, you have to talk about the rents that are on the market now and the rents of people who are stable in their housing. So what we see is this gap, which is very big. In Zurich, we have only a vacancy rate of 0.07%, meaning that there is hardly any housing on the market, and the little housing that is on the market is this type of housing, which is obviously unaffordable by people who have been displaced. Indeed, there are statistical data already showing that the people who have been displaced have a monthly income 4,000 Swiss francs below the average of the city, and the people who move in the newly built apartments have an income that is about 3,800 francs higher than the people who moved out. So these data are quite clearly show that the city, the whole social fabric of the city is changing, and that people are systematically displaced from their houses. So it's very clear, and it's very dramatic in the city of Zurich. We will talk later about mitigation measures, which in some cities are slightly more effective than in others. But in Zurich, we see a massive displacement and gentrification caused by urban densification, and now I will come to energy refurbishments, which are another problem. I mean, energy refurbishments in Switzerland are highly subsidized, and again, it means that subsidies are being given to homeowners, meaning owners of residential housing, not private family, also of course to private individuals, but we see that those who are indeed refurbishing are mainly owners of multi-apartment buildings, be it institutional owners, primarily institutional owners. And the effect here again is that, first of all, the value increase that the housing gains can be transferred to tenants, so the rents increase significantly. Also because these refurbishments normally are not just done, it's not just energy refurbishments, but the owners take an advantage to do multiple refurbishments at the same time, and this increased value can be passed to tenants. Another perverse impact of these energy refurbishment policies is that they create, they legitimize actually expulsion of the tenants. They legitimize the evictions, meaning that in Switzerland you can hardly increase, there is some sort of rental protection, not even that bad. You cannot increase the rent just as you want. You can only increase the rents if you do some improvements in your housing. And it's also the condition under which you can actually discontinue the tenancy contract. So energy refurbishments have become a very appropriate means to discontinue tenancy contracts, make investments, and then ask rents that can be more than double the rents before. They can, of course, also trigger incentives to demolish the existing housing, which again, if you look at housing with a more life cycle perspective, we see now that actually this whole demolition of housing stock that is perfect condition is creating a lot of problems also. I mean, it starts also to be questioned, you know, does energy consumption of the existing housing stock, is that the criteria, or should we have a more comprehensive look at the sustainability of housing? We then move to nature-based solution. Also here, the city of Zurich does provide, I mean, many cities in Switzerland, the city of Zurich also, they provide, again, subsidies to homeowners to green their facades and their roofs. And again, who has access to these subsidies? It's of course homeowners. And again, what impact it's going to have? It certainly has a positive impact on the climate. I was recently on a guided tour organized by the city of Zurich that explained very in detail what type of thermal impact greening of facades and planting trees on private properties has on the overall urban climate. Great, but again, what does it mean actually in terms of rents and rents increases and housing affordability, and who can live in this green housing? So, but then I would like to move to a case which is very blatant, and we are actually analyzing currently in the framework of our rehousing project, which is a park. And this is a park that was built on top of a highway, so it's a classical example of a nature-based solution that has a tremendous impact on the neighborhood. First of all, the quality of the neighborhood is certainly increasing massively thanks to this park. It's a 1 kilometer long park on top of a highway, and in a neighborhood that was very much a working class neighborhood, and that was actually crossed, cut into by this very noisy, very polluting highway. Great, the park came, wonderful improvement of the overall quality of the neighborhood. But what is happening here, and it's very publicly and proudly announced, that all the houses that are around this park are going to be demolished. And the city of Zurich argues that it's not going to cause any displacement because actually about quite a high proportion of housing in this neighborhood, 40% or more, belongs to housing cooperatives, which is non-profit housing. But even housing cooperatives, if they demolish their existing housing stock and they build new according to the new building standards and according to the new sort of expectations of what is good housing, the prices are increasing, the rents are going to increase even very much in the non-profit housing sector. And of course, not all the housing in this neighborhood is non-profit, there is also housing that is for profit, and we will see this neighborhood in 10 years, you will not recognize it. This picture I took at the very day that the park was inaugurated, which was a little over a month ago, and you could see all around the park that, so you see typically the house in the background is housing that is going to be demolished. What we have very unique in Switzerland, we have these elements which show what buildings will come up. In Italian we call them modine. It's a system, so you see these metal poles are actually showing what type, the profile of the new housing that is coming up there. And very much proudly, all these cooperatives during the inauguration day showed along the park the type of housing they are going to build, and by demolishing this type of housing. I was just standing near this elderly couple that were looking at this housing, and the lady said, "Oh, this housing looks so beautiful." And the gentleman said, "Well, what's the use of it if I cannot afford it anymore?" So you could see the people living in this neighborhood, living really in great fear. It's also, we have in Switzerland also a problem of an aging population. In this particular neighborhood, lots of elderly people will be forced to leave the neighborhood. Many of these people will prematurely come into old retirement homes, which also, by the way, has a public cost apart from the personal trauma of this experience, and many people, younger people, will have to leave the city. So this neighborhood is going to be a great, beautiful neighborhood. Many people will want to live in this neighborhood in the future, but it is not going to be the neighborhood for the current existing population. And of course, when you can, I don't know whether I can manage to, and of course, what you have a housing crisis in Zurich, which is very much felt, and people are going to the street. We have regular demonstrations of the people in Zurich protesting against the current housing crisis and asking that it be solved. So that is all from my side. Thank you for the time being. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We couldn't listen to the voice of the last short video, but you can imagine what these people told. Yeah. Okay. So Gerald, what is your answer or remark on these issues?
So this was an answer to the question about what are the effects of vulnerability for the poor people and their housing. Well, the situation you're describing in Zurich and the compact nature is clearly a policy designed for mitigation and not necessarily for adaptation. Because it's not clear to me that going tall and closely spaced buildings is going to offer you a lot of adaptation. But it certainly will offer mitigation. The way I see, well, certainly if I was to take what's happening right now about how we're dealing with climate, we're dealing with it basically by shifting the burden for the people to actually adapt by simply leaving spaces that they can no longer occupy to occupy other spaces. This is an example from Vancouver, but I can find these pictures of cooling centres, of course, throughout Paris and throughout London now. In fact, London actually has a cooling map telling people where to go inside the city to get cool during events like this. In fact, some of the areas that they describe in London as cooling centres are places that you would not occupy at any other time of the year because they're so compact, they never get any sunshine at the ground level. The alternative is actual genuine investment in public spaces that can take some of the pressure off the housing stock to some extent, because I'm not entirely convinced many cities in Europe want to be zero carbon by 2050. I'm not convinced that they're going to be able to do it. And I don't think that it's necessary. It's good to have a target, but I do think you need to get a balance about what the buildings are trying to achieve and what the city is trying to achieve. This is an image here from Nîmes in France, which I think is a beautiful piece of design. It's publicly accessible. It's got water, it's got green, it's got shading. It's located very, very close to the train station. So I think that this represents, for me, the best way that a city can intervene to actually address some of the climate issues that they face. If I don't do it at a neighborhood scale, which is what this would represent, then you're going to do it at a building scale. Now, one way to do the mitigation issue is to go compact. And the international evidence says clearly that the more densely populated an area is, the lower the energy spent per person. But there's other ways of achieving the same goal through, for example, refurbishment or through community design of solar energy generation, for example. So, but this only works if the entire neighborhood's involved. What I see, unfortunately, is too much of the climate change policies in cities are driven by subsidies to private owners to actually address refurbishment in their own house. And this leaves out, obviously, people who are not confident taking loans and renters, because the renters don't have to, they just have to pay the price of it. So I'm not sure that intervening the way we're doing it, either by going tall and compact, or by giving subsidies for individuals to create spaces, to fix up their houses, is the way to achieve the outcome. I'd also say that for a lot of the private development that does have actually significant greening strategies, a lot of that greening is actually inaccessible to anybody who lives inside the area. And they're often private parks, effectively. And finally, I'd say that the nature-based solutions, which are fundamentally based on things like greening rooftops, etc., I think are great from the point of view of whoever lives there, but I think they're pretty much pointless from a climate change point of view. That'd be my judgment. So I do think scale is very important for addressing many of these issues, and I'm not sure that going simply compact, for example, is a way to even address the climate change issues, never mind the housing crisis. Oh, I'm next. Okay, sorry. So there were 3 questions that I've imposed. This was the third one. What type of social intervention addressed the negative consequences of climate mitigation and adaptation policies? I've sort of thought about this from my own work because I work, as I say, in terms of climate change, but I also work with some communities in Dublin about how they can address their own neighbourhood issues, which some might be about housing, but a lot of it's about the shared outdoor spaces. So I'm going to just give you a brief example, and I would position this in terms of the right of citizens to decent outdoor spaces that they can avail of. And that might mean, for example, that the city has to actually intervene a lot more in the public space that is available to itself and actually make changes. And my personal view is that the big battles of the future will take place around the use of those public spaces. And if I look at a city, if I remove the buildings, if I move the space that the cities own, which are private parks, then what you're left fundamentally with are the road network. And I don't know if people recollect it, but these were a very, very important piece of life during COVID. And I do think we're going to have to rethink how we use public spaces to make sure they're accessible to everybody and designed for use, not simply spaces that are barren. Here's my example. If I was to map trees across Dublin, I would find that, not surprisingly, the oldest, densest part of the city has the fewest trees. And a lot of the trees that exist inside the city centre will exist in people's private back gardens. So they have their own private spaces. And then if I were to go out further, I'd see there's big green patches located in the outskirts of Dublin, and these are almost entirely correlated with wealth. Not surprisingly, if I've got more money, I buy a bigger house that has a bigger garden, and lo and behold, I probably have a tree. But if I live in a poor part of the city where the spaces are much denser, much more closely occupied and built upon, then you don't get trees. So if I was to look in the city centre, then if I were to map out the city centre itself, it's very close to being a stone, which is actually true for a lot of Paris too. It's pretty much solid. So here's the question about how much of that space you're prepared to give over for other types of use. And it means often interventions at a micro scale and at a street scale, at a neighbourhood scale, and it means, for example, in this case here, giving up a parking space. And I think this is where the future will be. My experience also tells me the only way you get anywhere is by actually getting the community itself to sit down and discuss their neighbourhood and identify where they want the changes to be made. Now, I'm not sure what the implications will be, that Jennifer pointed out, is what happens when the place gets improved. Then suddenly do the prices go up and those people leave? I don't know. I don't know, but I still think that as a basic right, same way you've got a right to good air quality, same way you've got rights to low noise levels, I think you have a right to green space within the area that you occupied. The only question then is, how big an area do you describe as being available for the population? And the challenge will come when we have these compact cities, as how do we also create those green spaces that are accessible? And this is a part of Dublin that I like, that's about to undergo radical change. Somebody's decided to describe what the future is for them, which is eventually to leave.
Thank you. An interesting dilemma to ask people. To ask local people what do they need more, a tree or a parking space? This is an interesting dilemma, and I am questioning how you can get an agreement between people, because some people would love the tree, others the parking space. Jennifer, what are your remarks on this?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you. And I wouldn't say that I'm not against park and against trees. To the contrary, of course, we all love parks and trees. And as I have seen also, as we have shown, there are interventions in this direction. The problem is, how can we prevent and mitigate the risk of people being actually evicted from their neighborhood, being priced out of neighborhoods where these type of facilities are being provided. And as densification is just one of the measures I presented, I also spoke about energy refurbishments and about nature-based solution. And in the case, maybe some of my colleagues know about their countries. I know in Spain there is already significant empirical research proving that parks are causing extreme gentrification processes. In Switzerland, we certainly are going to see that in the park which I showed. So what can be done? I mean, of course, how can we actually reconcile social environmental goals? That's the problem. We, of course, want to do, have an environment that is greener, that is cooler, and that is more adapted to the current conditions of climate change. But what do we need in order to prevent these negative social impacts? And I think, first of all, we need stronger rent controls. We need measures that prevent homeowners to displace the tenants. And that's even within Switzerland, we see quite strong differences between one city and the other. We have a very decentralized system, a federal system, and we see that, for instance, in the city of Geneva and Basel, it's much more difficult to evict people or to demolish a housing that is still in very good condition. Whereas in Zurich, even though on the one hand we have a very progressive housing policy, aspiring to have 1/3 of non-profit housing by 2050, currently we have 28% non-profit housing, but at the same time, there is this ambiguity because on the other hand, private owners, and it's still the majority, are allowed to do whatever they want. We did a case study of a building owned by Credit Suisse. It was totally refurbished in about 10, 20, 15 years ago. They put solar panels, they put elevators, they made a thermal insulation, and they decided to demolish the housing because it was just profitable to build something slightly more dense from a building, but especially building housing for a different clientele. And so, but in Zurich, there is this attitude, private property is sacred, we cannot intervene in this. And even in the city of Zurich, in Geneva, it's not like that. Even though also in Geneva, of course, private property is fairly sacred, but you are not allowed to demolish housing just like that. So we see there are different opportunities for cities to ensure that cities remain inclusive and affordable. And it is very much political will which determines whether some measures are being taken or not. So I think there is a lot of scope of reconciling social and environmental goals if we are really aware that that pursuing environmental goals, for instance, through nature-based solutions, entails significant risks for the local population. And that is currently not yet the case. That I think still there is insufficient awareness about the negative impacts that it can have on housing affordability, on inclusion, on displacement. And this is why actually, well, the EU seems to slightly becoming more aware of this, which is why we got actually support for studying these problems in different countries. And we do also hope, of course, to come up with policy recommendations that can show that are implementable and that get sufficient political support. In Switzerland, being a direct democracy, we see that there are currently a lot of political initiatives and asking for more rental protection, asking for a change, and maybe in other countries that is not so easy for citizens to intervene in political processes, but there are other instruments. But I think it's certainly important that, yes, citizens raise their voices, call awareness about this problem and contribute to political changes, put people at the center of this social and ecological transition.
Okay, so we need direct democracy, and we need also in other countries, probably, yeah. But let's have at the very end of this session some other suggestions. I took a slide from Housing Europe. Housing Europe is the strongest, strongest organization lobbying in Brussels for housing, for social housing landlords. It's a very strong, well-kept, well-financed organization which is looking very critically about EU legislation. And they have put together a presentation about the Social Climate Fund. Hopefully many of you have heard about the Social Climate Fund. It is not in effect yet, but it will come very soon because the EU planned to increase the taxes on energy. So the energy will become more expensive for heating and also for transport. And the increasing tax income is put into a fund which will be distributed among the member states, and member states will be asked to introduce the Social Climate Fund to address the social impacts arising from the new emission trading system for building and road transport. It will start in 2026 because the new tax system will start in 2027. The size of the fund is 65 billion euro, which is not nothing, as Hungarians would say. And this is roughly the allocation of the Social Climate Fund according to countries. And in each of such a graph, Poland is on the top of the graph because these are a large country, but also relatively poor. So they get a lot of this fund, but also other countries get a lot. And then what Housing Europe is asking the member state organizations, the large social landlords, have you heard about planning for the Social Climate Fund in your country? Because the countries were obliged to send their social climate program, climate fund program, by end of June this year. And it is completely unclear and not transparent what the national governments are doing in some countries at all. Each country should have a definite analysis of target groups and eligible measures, how a country will support the poor people if the prices of the energy is going up. Obviously, it would be nice if the renovation of the rental stock should be part of the national plan for the Social Climate Fund, especially if it would include that no rent increase is possible, if this is funded by the Social Climate Fund. So, in fact, Housing Europe is urging, or was urging, the social landlords to go to their national government and ask what is the Social Climate Fund. This was opportunity one. But then obviously affordable housing regulations are really very important. And you see here many examples for these inclusive zoning regulations in some quite innovative cities like Frankfurt, Toulouse, and Vienna, which means that X percentage of new housing has to be affordable. Then you also have countries or cities where affordability is also linked to resilience. So the city has a energy improvement plan for buildings, and even in these plans there are regulations that how much of that should be affordable. And for example, I call the attention of the last one, which is Brussels, which has a large-scale renovation program of 37,000 social housing units in different neighborhoods of the city. And it is really, the aim is to reduce the tenants' heating consumption and obviously to keep the tenants in their flats and not allow for renovation. But in fact, the really efficient example is Vienna. And unfortunately, Vienna is an example which I always mention. And then we can also mention that, yeah, but Vienna, we cannot do the same because Vienna is 100 years social democracy. They have a almost total control over the land market because the crucial issue is the land market. If you can control who gets the land for new building, then you can get in regulations which would very much echo what Jennifer said, that we should regulate what happens with the rent, what happens with new housing. So in fact, in Vienna, speculative investments are excluded. It's simply not possible. There are so strict regulations for new construction. And another opportunity, which I think is very important, is to look what you have in your housing market. And this is a French calculation which says that before you think to build one new housing, then you should look for empty units in the existing housing stock. You should look for the second homes which are standing empty during big part of the year, and some of them could be used as housing. You could also look at bad condition building which could be renovated, and you should look what you have in the office market. How could you transfer offices into housing? And if you add all this together, before you build one new unit, you will discover millions of potential housing units in the existing housing stock. And if we think about the post-growth economy, if you think about the risk of every new construction, then this is, I think, very important. And then a final thought is the metropolitan level, the city region. And one of the good examples is Greater London Authority, which has a plan, a strategic spatial development framework in which housing and transport and health are all included, and there is a coordinated development plan given for each neighborhood. And those neighborhoods are obviously supported in this plan, which have better access to public transport and can improve housing conditions. So in fact, I think if we could give more role to the metropolitan level, to the city regional level, these are usually not directly elected politicians. They can speak easier. They can create plans which they then give to the mayors of the area. That I know, Mayor, that you are thinking only in your constituency. You are only thinking about to be re-elected in 3 years. But why don't you consider the interest of the larger area? And maybe you can be re-elected with a more progressive program in which you says that my town is not only responsible for my people, but also for the others. To have the metropolitan level as a planning, innovative planning level, which creates plans and then they could be voted in the places. So in fact, I think cities and metropolitan areas play a key role, and it was always emphasized in your case, Zurich, in your case, Dublin, that these are the places where you can do changes, but the plans could be done on a metropolitan level, and the national governments are crucial. So if there is no incentive given by the national government, not only for greening, but also to look at the social consequences and use the climate fund, social climate fund, which comes as an opportunity, then we are lost. And of course, the EU has a responsibility here. The EU is starting to discuss the affordable housing initiative. The EU is starting to discuss the agenda for cities. Now, in these discussions, this topic should be included. So this was now from our side. We have 25 minutes, although the organizers asked us to finish this plenary a bit earlier because we have to reach the place where lunch is. But I think there will be time for a few questions. So, yeah. So if there is someone who thinks that green and social can be in conflict, then please raise a question.
Hi, my name is Carola Fricke from Saarland University now. I used to live and work in Freiburg, and it's always the example for green urban development and housing, but I wanted to put a bit of a question mark behind it. Like, in my own experience, Freiburg has a very overheated housing market, which is also linked to all the measures taken by the municipality to, of course, prevent sprawl and so on. So it's a bit of a trade-off, I think, also in cities like Freiburg, between green and social goals to attend. And one thing that has come up in Freiburg, at least, or in the German discussion, or also broader, is to what extent we can really stick to our social levels or the qualities linked to social housing, for instance. There are quite some examples also in Freiburg where they refurbished social housing in order to make it more efficient. They kept the building, but just refurbished everything to have a better CO2 output. But the effect was that they needed money, so they made the apartments smaller. So you have an effect or a trade-off between. But then again, I was wondering to what extent we can really keep up with the current qualities of housing, to what extent we have to not only build better, but also build smaller in order to meet sufficiency goals. That was just my question also to the presenters. Can we maintain the quality of housing, the spaces that we occupy, or do we have to limit ourselves, which nobody wants?
Hi, Anna Pagani from King's College London. Thanks a lot for this very good panel, and I think that a lot of the points raised are really critical, especially within the framework of this conference. I wanted to comment and perhaps also ask for reflection on the fact, on a few points. Well, it emerges quite clearly that the tension between the environmental and social dimension in housing emerge within a capitalist framework. So it's a kind of a green growth that is predicated in the housing sector that is not only unachievable, but it's also strongly undesirable, which brings about this lose-lose and these artificial tensions, right? Because the tension between the environmental and social dimension are not there outside of a capitalist paradigm. And within that, I would like to ask for a first reflection on, in terms of how can we really rethink the political economy of housing to move towards a different, I've heard, post-growth or degrowth agenda. And the second will be, I fully agree that metropolitan areas play a crucial role, but at the same time, I'm interested in hearing more about the extent to which we should also encourage taking away land from the public and the private market, so both, towards more community, which might be more desirable. We could look at the example of how Margaret Thatcher turned all the social housing sector into private sector when it's in public hands. Thanks a lot.
More? And then you can answer.
We are coming to more and more radical suggestions.
I'm going to draw on some suggestions that Housing 2030 published in 2021, which we think are relevant to this question about renovating mandates and carbon pricing can worsen affordability and enable displacement. This is the tension. So mandating renovation without protection is the problem we see that can trigger these rent hikes, that evictions and gentrification that have been mentioned by Jenny. Sure, the nature-based solutions of space and the spatial planning and the neighbourhood approach is really also important. So it's terrific that that was also given attention. However, what I feel we need to move and can move forward on is some very concrete suggestions. And out of Housing 2030, we had 9 concerning tenant protections during renovation, concerning rent controls linked to energy rent retrofits. Thirdly, social safeguards in renovation programs and the right to return and on what basis. On actually spelling out the long-term investment costs and sharing those costs fairly, but spreading them out over a very long period of time. In particular, supporting energy poor and also poorer households directly to ensure that their housing stock is able to be improved, but they don't lose their tenancies. So direct support to them as well, to stay and remain in their communities. And also the focus on mission-focused providers and renovators of the stock who care about the residents that live there, that we should be promoting social efficacy in who we subsidise to renovate and improve the stock. Therefore, to work with not just any developer, but developers that literally care about people who live there, i.e. hopefully the social housing cooperative and non-profit sector. So these are implications from Housing 2030, which is that initiative of Housing Europe, UN Habitat and UNECE, which we tried to present in Brussels last week to focus their attention on this issue for the EU's affordable housing plan as well. What you're doing is very, very relevant and important, and I hope that you can progress to tangible recommendations to the affordable housing plan as well. I wish you well. Thank you.
A last one, but after you have 5 minutes to answer. So.
Hello, thank you for this topic. Branislav Antonic, University of Belgrade, Serbia. So my question is about this new initiative at EU level, European level. If you're targeting just big cities, metropolitan areas, what is about the other part of Europe, low density, more rural, small towns? Many of them are depopulating heavily, a lot of empty buildings, houses and so on. How to think about, many of them are actually not so old, so retrofitting something from 1970s, 1980s is not something out of the context. So, but they are still feeling like left behind. And there are huge potential untapped. And if this initiative is again focused on metropolitan areas and the big cities, what with them?
Okay, thank you. So I am now asking my fellow colleagues, what do you think?
Well, many issues were raised, many questions. But first of all, I think the importance of reducing surface consumption is very much an issue that is debated also in Switzerland, in many countries. Switzerland in the 1980s, the surface consumption per capita, living area per capita was 32 meters, now it's 47. So this is an important issue. There are many explanations for that, but very often, of course, the shrinking size of households is an important issue, the aging population. So we have many houses that are inhabited, large share of dwellings are inhabited by 1 or 2 persons only, and they consume a big surface. The rental market doesn't incentivize people to move, it's more costly to move. So there are needs. Again, there is a need of policy instruments that enable people to move on and also encourage people to move on when they don't need that surface anymore. And there is also, of course, and here we see in our department, there is also a challenge for architects rather than always talking about building more houses and building more houses for new housing needs, trying to transform the existing housing stock to the current needs. Another possibility, which I think is very much in Switzerland practiced by housing cooperatives, is to reduce the surface, the individual's consumption of living area in favor of communal spaces. And that has also not only environmental advantages in terms of reducing the surface, but certainly also social advantages in terms of also creating more social cohesion. So these are some very concrete measures that both require policy and incentives, but also different housing typologies. And when I say different housing typologies, it's not building more housing, but trying to make the best with the existing housing stock, creating incentives and possibilities for people to move around or to transform existing housing in dwellings that are more appropriate, not maybe just from the surface point of view, but also to respond to social needs. And we are, by the way, going to talk about this issue within the framework of a session on single-family houses. We see that a lot of people live in single-family houses that are under-occupied, and if these single-family houses would be adapted and made available for larger households, that would also be a way of reducing the surface consumption. Then, well, I agree, of course, fully with Anna that these tensions are also artificial. These tensions exist within a financialized housing market, and if the housing market wasn't as financialized as it is current, and if it was a more socially oriented housing policy, these tensions would be there. So we are talking about negative social impacts within a financialized housing market. So measures to mitigate, to reduce, to control this dramatic financialization of the housing market are definitively required. And there is certainly a need of rethinking that. And yeah, that's from my side, basically. That there was the question about the small city. That's also something we are exploring in our project, Horizon project. We don't have data yet, but yes, we see, of course, that we always focus on the big cities and that the reality in small cities is very different, again, within a country, but also across countries. The problem of depopulation in smaller cities in some European countries, poverty, neglect of the housing stock is a completely different reality, which exists. I think is important that we shift our focus also to these areas. At this stage, I wouldn't be able to say much about this. I think in Hungary, the problem is more understood and more exacerbated also than perhaps in tiny Switzerland. I don't know whether you know something, but I wouldn't be able to say more than acknowledging that this is a very important issue that we need to remember. Not everybody lives in the big cities.
Well, Isabel, because it's not my strength, the climate is changing. Cities are at the centre line, they are going to have to mitigate, which means refurbish. Now, I'm not convinced that all houses have to be refurbished to A levels, because I think you can do a lot more clever things in terms of connecting neighbourhoods to each other, so that a high energy neighbourhood could be linked to one which is low energy, and you could have shared, and that would mean that you wouldn't have to spend a lot on refurbishing areas and displacing people. I do think a rights-based approach which accounts for private-public space is critical, because I just do not see, in the current framework of most cities, an opportunity to intervene radically in changing the neighbourhood environment. And the reason for this is because it's all individualised and private. And this greatly limits the opportunity to make radical changes to cities. The rights-based approach, for me, would have the opportunity of ensuring that you don't end up with an area that's usually dismal, that then gets greened and then people occupy it. But at least if everybody had a right to a decent park, trees, green spaces, properly designed, if everybody had rights to that, a lot of those distinctions that you see, radical distinctions in cities, simply wouldn't exist. But we do this on a parsimonious basis. And the consequence is a neighbourhood that's coming up gets all the greening, and therefore it becomes cool, and then people want to move in, we get displacement. In fact, I don't see so much displacement as simply the fact that the locals there simply don't see a future for their children, so they leave. So I think the balance for me is the private-public. That, for me, is the key. But I think we also have to simply accept that the climate is changing. And if you want cities to be part of the solution, it's going to involve mitigation. The only question is, does that mitigation adaptation, does it cause people to be pushed out? From my experience in Dublin City, the social housing actually seems to be far better at refurbishing than what I see as the poor working class, who probably own their own homes, are renting their own homes, and they'd have no capacity to mitigate. Whereas at least the city is required to intervene in the social housing.
Yeah, maybe a few final words. I agree that sufficiency is a key issue, and we will not find solution to these problems if we only think in growth, because growth is limited and growth is unequally allocated, and growth is socially unjust. So, but how to bring closer sufficiency, how to convince the rich people that it could be possible not to fly with private jets, not to use these large cars, to give up some of their housing space for their next moves and for their kids, this is extremely difficult. So I don't need your answer on that. I only see a few bad solutions. So for me, the plan of the Netherlands to build 1 million new housing, for me it is totally questionable. We remember of the 1970s, the Swedish 1 million program to build in a very quick, short time, 1 million new housing, and these areas are now the most problematic areas of the Swedish cities. This is not a solution for a problem. You should find more fine-tuned solutions which are more in line of this very complex problem. Vienna is thinking about a new regulation that only those developers should be allowed to develop which are developing in public interest. Now, this is a very interesting idea, but again, it is only Vienna which can think in these terms because they control the land market. And finally, about the question from Belgrade about the smaller cities, yes, the smaller cities are usually not on the horizon of the people, of the politicians. I would, of course, if Serbia would be part of the European Union, hopefully once it will become part of the European Union, then the Social Climate Fund would be an opportunity, and this money allocated by the national government, part of them could be given to small cities under one condition, that they do not allow urban sprawl. Because in fact today, the smallest cities have the largest urban sprawl. And this is a statistics which shows that in Romania, in Serbia, there are cities which are losing 20–30% of the population, but still the mayor thinks that the only way to go forward is new housing estates for the talents. So a part of the city stays empty. I think it's a very complex topic, but there are some solutions on the horizon. And now I think we need some information about lunch. Yeah.
Just to thank, to explain that Vanesa Castan Broto couldn't come, and she was very disappointed on the first one, the first information, and the second is that we should also thank Margot Pellegrino and Caroline Gallez for the organization behind of this session. And practical information, so now we will have a lunch. The lunch is vegan. It's a specific insertion company, we could say, entreprise d'insertion. I don't know how to translate that, but that means that it is taken in charge some people who are in an insertion career, we could say. Okay, and the second point is that after you will go out, you will take the lunch outside, but don't worry, we have some places where you could have less eat, and so you will have students who will explain you the different places where you can eat inside. And the last point is that the workshops wouldn't be there. They would be in the first building you were in to register, okay? So